this one, interesting or annoying unusual things. And the first one I'm going to show you is this 98 Ranger, which is a vehicle I had when I was in Allen Park. Well, I'm sorry, it came from Allen Park, Michigan. It was not in Allen Park, Michigan. It had been underwater, they couldn't sell it, so I asked Ford for a trailer and they sent me this one back in 2001. Really nice little truck. The only thing wrong with it after having been underwater, which is why they couldn't sell it, was the speedometer didn't work right. But anyway, I was, for years, I mean for nearly 20 years we used this. I was careful with this one, and we did a lot of stuff to it, you know. I would take the brakes all apart on it left, and whenever it came brake final exam time, I would have all the brakes all took apart. And the stuff over there on a bench in a pile. And the students would have to take all of that stuff and bleed the brakes and get them working as a part of their final exam for brakes. Now, I didn't do that every year. When I did do it, it was a grueling final, and they felt like they had done something. I always had the idea itself to feel like they had been through the meat grinder. That way they would feel like they were more prepared for the real world, you know. But anyway, this one here, the student, over close to the time I retired, he pulled the steering rack off of this vehicle as a part of an put it back on, bled the steering out, and when he got done, he parked it out, and somebody came by and noticed smoke coming from under the hood of it, you know, because it was just, you know, down to its first latch. And so somebody raised the hood, and it had caught fire there at the alternator area. For some strange reason, the alternator had caught fire. Had nothing that boy did. It's a classic example of what people think, you know, we messed something up when we worked on the car, doing that. And, you know, sometimes we do mess up, but sometimes it's got nothing to do with what we did. So this was one of those times, and this vehicle wound up getting retired because we'd had it so long. And the new instructor just decided to get rid of it, you know, after he went to work over there. This right here was a special adapter I made to change the transmission using the transmission flush machine that we had. And the president of the college had an E320 Mercedes. It was 2004 model, and he bought it. He was kind of conservative in his spending, you know, and he bought this, it was his personal car, one car. And he said, he was telling me the transmission fluid was lifetime fluid and never needed changed according to what he had read in the literature. And I told him I'm not terribly familiar with that car, but you know, some of those Mercedes having lifetime transmission fluid. Well, after a couple of years, it's giving trouble. The transmission wasn't working right. And so I said, well, go ahead and do a transmission fluid exchange. Get me the right fluid for this vehicle, and I will go ahead and do a full fluid exchange. So that's what we did. And typically, when I do a full fluid exchange, what I would like to do is run, you know, you're hooking the machine up between the transmission cooler line and the cooler, and the fluid that comes out of the transmission is going to go into the machine, and while the new fluid, it's in a separate, the new fluid goes back into the transmission. Then when we were done with all of that, I'd take an extra whatever it took, and we would do a transmission service. Drop the pan, change out the filter, clean the pan out, put it back up with the gasket and filter and all that. And that way they had all the transmission fluid new in there. I had seen that this fix a Cadillac crossover that came in there with fluid that was a trans quite working right, and it had I don't remember all the symptoms, but it wasn't shifting right. They didn't like something had changed. I don't remember what it was. And so I says, well, we looked at the fluid, and it looked, I'm not kidding you, it looked like brake fluid. You know how brake fluid gets dark in the master cylinder and all that? And I said, well, we didn't do that. So we changed out that fluid, put the right fluid back in it, and fixed that Cadillac. So I postulated we can do that with this one. So we went ahead and did that, and took care of this problem. And I had to build this adapter. This adapter right down here, this was an AC line that was one of those that's got the little spring coupler where you snap it in. And so I got this little part off that went around here and was able to use this, an adapter, because our machine didn't have one that would fit this Mercedes, you know. And so let's just go ahead and do that, you know. So anyway, that took care of the problem on that. There was another vehicle that had come in there before we even had a transmission fluid exchange that it would hunker down and stop when she pulled up to a light, like the burner wasn't disengaging, and we checked all the electrical and everything on it, and I says, well, have anything to lose, let's just go ahead and change the transmission fluid. And I just did a 5-quarter exchange on that, and then we'll put some seafoam transmission tune in there. She did that and she never had another problem, you know, just go figure or whatever. But anyway, this right here was what the fluid looked like on that E320 though. You see how right here, how it looks coming out of there, you know. I mean, that's just ugly stuff. And it was going this way out and going that way, coming back in. And we wound up getting that thing straightened out, and he was really happy. I always like looking at that nice clean from back in there and compare it to the dirty fluid going out, you know. So, all right, here was a Grand Marquis water leak. My dad brought his Grand Marquis over there because it wasn't working right, so we put a cable on it. One of the students did. And the next time it rained, he says, hey, I've got water all on the floor, and I never had that before. So he brought it back over there, and I got under the dash and looked. Grommet was out of place. And whenever it rained, you know, it's right over there close to the left side. The hood meets the fender, and water would run in there, and that cable was kind of going up and down that cable and just go right on in the car and just put lots of water in the car. And, anyway, I said that was a lesson that I taught that guy who now works at a dealership somewhere else. Always put those grommets back in place. They're there for a reason. The hood latch worked great. He had created another problem that wasn't there before he changed it, and apparently he didn't see that as all that, or just didn't think about it or forgot. I don't know what the deal was, but I don't imagine he ever made that again because it was a mess. Now, whenever water gets in the floor, what do? We had one of these vehicles. It was a trainer vehicle that had been left outside with the windows down. It was a 2006 student. Parked it outside with the windows down, went home with the key in his pocket. It was the only key I had to that vehicle. It was a nice car too. And what he did was, it rained, it wetted real good on the inside. So what we did was I took that thing and parked it in there on a Friday afternoon. And I opened all the doors and I put 2 fans blowing through them all weekend long. And after fans blew through there all weekend long, it pretty well dried it out. Now, if the carpet's really, really, really wet, you usually won't get it all out of there like that. And what we used to do was we would put pull the carpet out of the car and hang it on the fence for a day or so out in the sun, and then we'd put it back in. Now, I know that one of the things I did in fundamental would teach the students to pull the seats out and put them back in by having them do that on one of the trainer vehicles, like the Mercury Sable that we had. And I said, pull all the seats out, put them on the floor, put them back in, bolt them down, and trim parts back on the, you know, where they bolt on there too. I mean, because all of that detail, people notice that when you forget stuff like that. But anyway, that's just a little detail-oriented thing. Right here is a commutator tool that was made by you know, back when we used to recondition starters, when I worked at that gas station in the 70s, and also when I worked at the shop in the later 70s, we would recondition. We'd pull starters off. It wasn't that we never replaced a starter, but a lot of the times we would pull them off with the bushings and and whatnot in the starter drive. You know, starter drive was something we had to replace a lot of back in those days. You know, whenever it goes or something like that, you know, typically the little one-way clutch failing in the starter drive when it does something like that. And it was very annoying. Ford seemed to have to do that, have that starter drive fail. But one way or another, this little places in between the commutator strips right here. Let me change my color. These little things. We would actually, at the station, we would take a hacksaw and we would saw them dots down so that they were actually lower, you know, so it would be lower than the other commutator strip. To be perfectly honest, I never really purposed in that, but it was a thing apparently because Snap-on made this little saw blade mode where you'd put the commutator in there and you would run that, you would run it back and forth across this saw blade while it was, and you were basically doing that not by hand but with this little fancy little machine. And you notice this is a Snap-on tool, you know, too. It was made for that. It was at the college when I went to work there, and that college automotive department had been there since 1965. And so that, you know, this dated back into the days whenever a lot of starter reconditioning was going on. I used to take, when we would replace a starter, which is what most of the time people do nowadays, I would usually bore, and I would have the students tear the starters down and figure out what was wrong with them, you know, try to tinker with them, fix them, put them back together, see if they work and all that kind of thing, because being able to tear a starter down together is very useful. Alternators too, you know, we do the same thing with that. Alternators are kind of annoying. Tearing those down, a lot of times you got to desolder a rectifier bridge and that kind of stuff, and it's not, it used to be on tearing alternators down, not on all of them anyway. This was an obscure oil leak on a Toyota Camry that had an oil leak, and it was really not an oil leak, but it was bad enough that the customer was concerned about it, so we put some dye in there. You can also take some Dr. Scholl's foot spray and spray it all over there, you know, wherever you think the oil is leaking, and that Dr. Scholl's foot spray, when the oil's coming out, wherever it is, you can see it real easy. What we would do on this one, we put some dye in there, and this dye would light up orange whenever the black light hit it. It turned out that the oil leak on this Camry was coming from under the oil filler cap because the oil filler cap seal got hard. And so all we had to do to fix this oil leak was replace the oil filler cap. But determine the source of the leak is how you first start to decide where you're going to fix it. It's really easy sometimes because some people will look and they'll see oil dripping off of the bottom of the bell housing, assume that's a rear main seal, when actually if the oil's coming from above there, it'll run down there and drip off. It'll fool you. You know, so anyway, we took care of this one here. All right, this Silver had a similar situation. The oil was coming out around the filler cap, but the problem with this one was, it's like a 07 model with a 5.3 as I remember, and the boy would go and he was very curious about checking his oil, and so he pulled in there. When he got home, as soon as he got open the hood and he checked the oil, it would be a quart low, read a quart low, and he'd become alarmed a quart to it. Well, what he needed to do was wait before he checked the oil in that particular engine, because like on some of the older engines that had, you know, if you had, I don't know what's going on with these 5.3s, I had never investigated it, but I do know on one of these 5.3s, you need about an hour before you check the oil, because the oil that drains down out of the valve cover area is going to bring that oil level up. If you just pour oil in there to bring it up to full, when all that hadn't drained, you're going to wind up when it's over full. And that's what this guy had. And if that wasn't enough, he had his PCV system too. The PCV system on this one here, the PCV valve is actually, it's a little orifice tube. I mean, a tube with an orifice in the bottom of it is built into the valve cover. And you know, there had oil puddled up in it, right? So we took this off, looked at that, oil's puddled up. They have a replacement valve cover that's got some different baffling in it and whatnot to alleviate concern. But you can't just put a PCV valve on it, you got to replace the valve cover on this one right here. The valve cover costs about $140 usually. You can buy them online or you can buy them from, you know, wherever you decide to get them from. It's a fairly common thing on these to replace that. You can see that that valve cover, I mean that PCV nipple right there, you know. Alright, so this was us looking at a coolant leak that went out from the wheel well area on a 2006 Grand, I mean, let me see, it was a Commander, Jeep Commander. And I said, what in the world is this about? You know, because it was running on these tubes and dripping out. Talk about one that is dripping somewhere else other than where it's leaking. If you've got these lines and pipes and wires and all, they'll carry that stuff and it'll drip somewhere else. It's about as annoying as trying to find a leak on the roof of a house. But what we found in here was, you know, of course it was leaking off the exhaust down here too. But I noticed when I got under there and looked where the heater core, you know, heater hoses were hooked up and doing all the stuff they did. Here had a clamp that was, this clamp was like this, like you see it right here. Whenever I got under there, it was just dangling loose and all. I don't know why they left that loose, but what they had, somebody had got under there and they had bought some cheap second-rate hardware store tea, and see how it got too hot. It wasn't made for hot coolant, couldn't handle it, and so the problem with all of that was they wound up with a leak that was, it would eventually be bad enough to cause serious problems. They didn't leak enough coolant to cause engine damage, but that needed to be fixed. And as I remember, when I ordered a tea from the parts store, I got one that was a metal one or aluminum. if I remember. I may have got a plastic one because a plastic tee, I don't really like hot coolant flowing through plastic anyway, but a lot of these car makers have got, you know, coolant being carried by plastic. You remember the Crown Vias had that plastic channel going across the front for the thermostat crossover, and the manifold that was split, and sometimes they burn the motor up. And when you get a replacement manifold, that coolant passageway is an aluminum piece. You know, they did away with the plastic flowing through the coolant on that one because you can kill her. You know, this is one of my grandsons fixing the power window in his Honda Element. He bought this 2009 Honda Element from his Uncle Matt, and whenever he was driving it to work, and one day he called Dad, who's my youngest son, and he said, "Hey, this power window won't work, I hope today." And so my youngest son bought, you know, my youngest son's 38, he bought a couple of power window regulators off Amazon and put my grand to work fixing his own power windows, which is a good thing because there are some things that men just need to know how to do, you know what I mean? And you know, I worked really hard to teach my guys so that, you know, my son Luke was telling me, this boy's dad, that when he was 14 years old, the teacher at one of his classes had brought some boards and stuff, and they were going to build these, school he was in, and they were going to build these planters to put flower boxes out there and all out of board. There were 33 kids in that class, and he was the only one of them that knew how to use a skill saw or drive a nail. That was in that particular area. It's not like that everywhere. You know, in some of these rural communities, they know a heck of a lot about tools and hammers and nails and saws and all that kind of stuff, but none of those kids except that class knew that, because I taught him that growing up. Anything we teach these kids growing up, they're going to be better off for if it's how to fix something, you know, rather than just playing a video game all day. Now this truck, doing what trucks were made to do. I love these kind of situations here. Somewhere between an 87 and a 91 F-Series pickup. And to be out there driving, and I saw this thing, and I snapped this pickup, a mirrorless Alpha 6000 Sony camera I carry with me all the time, and I snapped a picture of this truck. And this is really good because see the American flag back there, and you see this American truck, and it's powerful. Now, even if somebody's driving a Toyota or a Nissan and they're in America, it's still an American truck. This old truck right here was dear to my heart whenever I saw all this stuff. I guess they were to salvage or something, but boy, this was really something to behold, you know. I really enjoy this kind of stuff. That's what a truck's meant to do. And you know, they got the tail lights taped up over here. I don't know what this red paint's about, unless they just decided they were going to put something on there and paint it red. It was, you know. But that truck, I don't care what you think about it, it's got character, and it still runs, and it still hauls heavy loads. It's really cool. This was the bearing that really surprised me, because I like to take a bearing apart after I've changed it. I mentioned that in a video, and see if it's brindled or whatever. This one was not. This was the bearing right here, and look how pretty and polished that the race is. There was not a single ball on any of these balls. But the grease had turned brown, you know, off as water intrusion or whatever, but it seemed like you'd see some pitting or something. This grease, you know, looked cleaner and whiter. This bearing wasn't making any noise. That one was. I just totally bogged down. I was trying to figure out. You know, I always like to verify by going in there saying, this is why it was making noise. And usually you see that on a bearing, but on this one I didn't. Now I mentioned this in a video too, but I couldn't find this picture until this time around. This right here is a damper on the fuel rail, and what the pulsation damper does is it basically absorbs fuel injector, you know, the pulse, the pressure waves that go through the fuel rail will basically tend to be noisy. They'll make the lines rattle and bounce against the, you know, you'll hear them. So they put a damper in there, and it's kind of like jumping on a trampoline. It absorbs it's almost like an accumulator, but not really, because it's got a diaphragm in there that bounces. Well, there's one on these Asian vehicles, and you'll see this on some Mazdas, some Lexus, some Toyotas, some Hondas. This is an Asian thing primarily. Notice this one here is a Denso brand. But that damper, when some of them you'll have to pull this plastic cover off to see this screw. But the point is, this screw right here whenever you turn on the key and the fuel pump, then you see this screw move, right? Okay, so that tells you you got 40 pounds in there. It doesn't tell you if that pressure is water or fuel or what it is. It could be or whatever. But you at least know that the fuel pump's running. Now, what do you know when you turn on the key and the fuel pump? You know the engine controller is awake and able to activate the fuel pump. So you've eliminated the stuff you don't even need to check if you can see that you have fuel pressure. This is a good idea that they with. And I went to the Toyota dealership one time years ago and pointed out on a vehicle one of the mechanics was working on, and he said, I didn't even know about that. And I said, oh yeah, if on the key you'll see that screw move if it's got fuel pressure. And I don't know if they just didn't fit Toyota's T10 school or whatever. But like I say, I've seen this on Hondas, Mazdas, Lexus vehicles, you know, which is Lexus is like a Toyota anyway. But that's just something I've talked about on here. I like to revisit this stuff every now and then. This one here was a lot of fun. This was on a 2012 Ford Fusion. You know, whenever I used to tell the students, you know, put that car up on the lift and get the wheels off of it. You know, we're going to rotate the tire. We're going to do maybe one of them was losing a little too much air. Yeah, you got 4 tires that 3 pounds in them and 1 pound. One that's got 22. You know, so basically you're going to need to look for a leak in that one. I'm going to pull it off, and somebody had screwed up and put the lug nut on there to ram it on there with an impact wrench or whatever, and they managed to mess this all up, and they managed to get it cut up. But when we went to pull it out, it spun those splines in there, so we had to drive a big old Mack pry bar in there between the wheel and the, so we could foul it right here in this area against the hub, so we could force that lug nut off there. Of course, we replaced the lug stud after that. That reminds me of that one time when I was parts guy that I didn't know. I don't like talking to a young parts man that I don't know. If I got a young parts man I trust, that's okay, but if it's a brand new young parts man, I'm really spooked by that. And this wasn't really a big deal, but I told him, I said, I want a lug nut for a 2007 Toyota Corolla. He told me front or rear. And I'm thinking, boy, I'm in big trouble here now. So, of course, the studs can be different front or rear, but not the lug nuts. The lug nuts are going to be the same all the way around. And I think he was just giving me he was asking a question in time until he could get to the next screen. And he didn't think about how it sounded when he said front or when I was talking about a lug nut. As it was, I sent the lug nut up there and he matched it up and sent me the right one back. This is when your wife gives you a stick of girly deodorant because you ran out of your, manly flavor. And I didn't want some, guy coming in here borrowing the bathroom and seeing some girly deodorant in my bathroom. So I make myself my own little part to make myself a nice little manly label for this thing and stuck it on there. There's always a great deal of fun like that. But, that's a little random slide. Now this was flashing back coolant refill I was talking about. This is on a 2005 Pathfinder, and to get the air when we had to raise the front of it up. I knew about this. I had heard about this at the Mobile Air Conditioning Society whenever I was sitting in some of those little symposiums and people were talking about, cooling system bleeding and air conditioner work and all that. They were saying that a lot of these vehicles, what you got to think about is if the filler is low in any part of the rest of the system. See, this one here's got a cap in the middle of the radiator and it's also got another one over here. But this one here does not have a spring and all that on it. Remember, it's basically just a cap where you fill it up to work all the air out of it. But if you don't jack that thing up, this one here has actually got that funky $200 plus heater and electric water pump built into it and all that. So there's an awful lot of stuff that has to happen air out of this one, And so that's what we had to do there. And you may have to jack some of these. I never would have thought you would have had to do this on this Pathfinder, but we did. He had to put a heater core in this one. I mean, not a heater core, but an evaporator core. Can't remember if it was a heater core. Long and short of it was, when he got done, in order to bleed this thing out, filling the cooling system is not like pouring water in a bucket. You need to make sure you got all the air out of there, and that's why a lot of them have got bleeder valves on them and that kind of stuff. It's always a good idea to consult the shop manual, see what they tell you to do. Some of them will tell you to squeeze the upper radiator hose and help work the air out. all kind of crazy stuff. Occasionally you'll run across one, and I just ran across one time that said it had a bleeder valve. Have one. You know, I went to the spot where they illustrated it on that particular vehicle. I don't remember what vehicle it was. Might have been some kind of a Geo SUV or something, but that one didn't have one. The book said it did. I would also, like I was talking about the other day, on some of these straight-ins, I would take a heater hose loose from up here at the front, and I would fill it up. I've actually put a fat heater hose nipple going down into the head and filled it up like that until it came out, you know, till everything filled up and it came out the heater hose, and I'd put it back on there real quick. And that's one of the ways you can be sure that it all worked out of there. It's just a wise thing to do. I reinstalled my starter, guy says, and now my charging system doesn't work. Well, you can look at it right here. This is the post that comes battery to the starter. This one right here only is hot when the solenoid is energized. It's going into there. So he actually, this looked good, but it wasn't right. So he put this, he was enough to put this under there, but you don't just pick one of the two posts and put this, you know, the fusible link charge wire that's going to the alternator under there. A lot of the vehicle manufacturers for a very long time have enjoyed using the posts on the for junction posts, because it works good for that. You got a good solution there. But you notice how these look so much alike. This was on an 06 Pontiac, as I remember. And so all we had to do to fix the charging system on this one, it was an easy fix, was to go ahead and move this wire right here to that. We moved this to that, that's what we did, and that's a problem. This right here is an interesting story about a 74 Range that the girl used. When I worked in Texas down there, we would fleet maintenance. We'd send this girl to town to get, she would do errands for everybody in the company, and she probably 200 miles a day on this Ranchero, and it was an old car when we got it. Somebody, I think the boss man's son had it and just donated it. She would go back and forth. It was a Ranchero, so it worked pretty good for that. But we would check the oil in it every morning before we did for town, because she would go in the morning and stay all day and all morning, and then she'd come back at lunch, back in the afternoon. Sometimes she'd have to go as far as Beaumont and all that. So she drove a lot, she went a lot of places. But the point is, this thing was using a quart of oil every 2 days. And I was taking to use it at the parts store at Spence Battery in Port Arthur. I says, look, we're going to have to do something. I guess we're going to put rings in a Ranchero or something, old and wore out as it is, because it's burning a quart of oil. He said, why don't you try Uniflow? Because he said, I have heard that Exxon Uniflow will make them not burn as much oil. Nothing to lose, you know, how much will it cost to do this? Let's just go ahead and get a case of this and put it in there. Because David, and I felt like he had, you know, he had heard that from a reliable source. We put that Exxon Uniflow in there. It went from a quart of oil every 2 days to a quart every 2 weeks. And I saw this happen, so this is not here. The point is, if you've got one that's using oil, sometimes if you just change the oil you're using, as long as you remain within the specs for that vehicle, you might be surprised. Will change oil consumption just because you're using a different oil. And this right here woke me up to that. I found this very hard to believe whenever even at that time, but I always remembered this, you know. So this was a wiring schematic in 1909 Ford shop manual. This is what we had to deal with. Imagine yourself having to, you know, start here. Let me change my color again. Let's start right here. Let's work our way down through here. Let's go through here. Let's go to that. And then we got to go through this connector, and then we got to see which one it comes out of. I mean, a lot of trouble. The newer shop manuals tell you where the connectors are. The GM was that they go through a grommet, you know, going through the bulkhead. They tell you where the connectors are, where the grounds are, how many pins there are in the connector. They'll even tell you which cavity in the connector this is going through. So you can actually break that harness down that way, enter it in. I remember one time this is sort of a sidetrack, but I got a foreman came and he asked me, you know, I was always really into this wire harness thing. There was a cutaway van or something that was giving some kind of a crazy problem. I found a pushed back pin in this one part of the wire harness. And the shop foreman was a really knowledgeable old mechanic, but he came, I've told stories about him before, he was funny anyway. But he came over there and he says, you know, there's a big block connector in between two of the wire harnesses. And he came over and he said, "What did you find on that cutaway van?" I said, "Well, you know that big wiring between the 9930 and the 12A581 wire harness?" And he goes, "Yeah." Then he called me a smart ass because he didn't know those numbers. I mean, I could point it. But I got used to this, had these numbers. The basic part number for the wire was just something I had burned in, and when I wasn't even trying to think about it. There was another time he came over there to work order I was writing. I had written on. And I said, I actually had a typewriter box, an old Royal typewriter like you see Jessica Fletcher typing her stuff on. And I was typing the back of my, and on the work order I had typed, "Belt was literally coming apart." Now, I'm kind of an intelligent guy, but his vocabulary wasn't all that great. And he would say funny stuff. But one day, what does literally mean? And I'm thinking, why is he even asking? And I said, "Well, you ever heard of hyperbole?" And he goes, "Don't start no crap now." Anyway, all right, this was the parts counter. I remember some of the best parts guys I've worked with. Even way back in the like I would go in a parts store when it looked like this one here, and you had all these books here that they had to flip through. And say, a lot of these parts men are trained to look stuff up a particular way, and they can't think outside that box. The Obi, the guy that worked at the parts store, he was actually the son that owned the gas station I worked at over in town up the road. I'd go in there and I'd say, "I need a solenoid switch for a Chevrolet starter." And Obi would go, and he would get it and put it on the counter. And I would pay for it, and then I would leave. I was like 9 years old, A lot of these older guys think a teenager don't know anything anyway, Some teenagers are sharper than others, and I didn't have all the answers, but I wasn't dumb as a brick either. Well, I went in there one day and Obi wasn't in there, and some other guy was in there that was older and he knew the guy, but I hadn't ever dealt with him very much. And I says, "I need a starter solar Chevrolet starter," which I had done that several times, and Obi always put one on the counter. The one he put on the counter always fit. This guy looked around and laughed at everybody like, "Oh, this kid's a real idiot." And he goes, "I can't sell you that unless you tell, car it comes off of and all." I said, "Okay." So I told him what it was, and he looked it up, and he gave me the same one that Obi always gave me. Well, what the parts guy, I had another parts guy at the Ford dealer, and I went in there and asked him for a top gasket for an Escort carburetor. He says, I said, "It's 83. He'd throw the gasket on the counter without even looking it up. The other parts guy always had to have the carburetor and everything so he could look it up, with his microfiche and make sure he did it the right way. And it was the only way he knew how to look up parts. Well, I asked James, the guy that just threw the gasket on the counter, "What's the difference between you and him, because you know which part it is without looking it up?" He said, "I just look and see what over is." He said, "There's only 2 gaskets for an Escort carburetor, and the breakover is 82. After an 83, it's a different gasket than it is if it's an 82. And I knew that, and I knew the part number, so that's what I got one. And that's a good parts man. He's, James says a good parts man will be just a little bit, but a good parts man will also go out of his way to find you what you want, no matter what he has. And that was one of the things that I really appreciated about James. He was a really good parts man. Rest his soul, a few years ago. This was a funny little nonsense question that I used to put nonsense, just kind of blindside my students with crazy questions that didn't seem to make any sense, And this was one, this vehicle on the lift. The right answer to this is, I have no idea, because you know why it's on the lift. You can look at it from here. There's nothing apparent as to why it's on the lift. You wanted to see what it looked like underneath. I don't know. See, I wasn't really going to count this question wrong regardless of how it did, because it was just a nonsense question anyway. But sometimes I just like to have fun with the student. Well, I may hit you guys with a pop test next week, and I really appreciate listening in, and we'll talk to you another time.